Hello, good morning, assalamu alaikum. How's everybody doing? It's been a few days since we did a little bit of Matilda, so I'm going to read a few more chapters for you. It seems that Matilda is more popular than Harry Potter right now, so I think you guys are appreciating the change. So I'm just going to get straight to it. I'm not going to waste any more of your time. All right, Chapter 7, Miss Honey. Matilda was a little late in starting school. Most children began primary school at 5 or even just before. But Matilda's parents, who weren't very concerned one way or the other about their daughter's education, had forgotten to make the proper arrangements in advance. She was 5.5 when she entered school for the first time. The village school for younger children was a bleak brick building called Trunchbull Primary School. It had about 250 pupils aged from 5 to just under 12 years old. The head teacher, the boss, the supreme commander of this establishment, was a formidable middle-aged lady whose name was Miss Trunchbull. Naturally, Matilda was put in the bottom class, where there were 18 other small boys and girls about the same age as her. Their teacher was called Miss Honey, and she could not have been more than 23 or 24. She had a lovely pale oval Madonna face with blue eyes, and her hair was light brown. Her body was so slim and fragile, one got the feeling that as she fell over, she would smash into 1,000 pieces, like a porcelain figure. Miss Jennifer Honey was a mild and quiet person who never raised her voice and was seldom seen to smile. But there is no doubt she possessed that rare gift for being adored by every small child under her care. She seemed to understand totally the bewilderment and fear that so often overwhelm young children who for the first time in their lives are herded into a classroom and told to obey orders. Some curious warmth that was almost tangible shone out of Miss Honey's face when she spoke to a confused and homesick newcomer to the class. Miss Trunchbull, the headmistress, was something else altogether. She was a gigantic holy terror, a fierce tyrannical monster who frightened the life out of the pupils and teachers alike. There was an aura of menace about her, even at a distance, and when she came up close, you could almost feel the dangerous heat radiating from her as from a red-hot rod of metal. When she marched, Miss Trunchbull never walked. She always marched like a stormtrooper with long strides and arms a-swinging. When she marched along a corridor, you could actually hear her snorting as she went. And if a group of children happened to be in her path, she plowed right on through them like a tank, with small people bouncing off to her left and right. Thank goodness we don't meet many people like her in this world, although they do exist, and all of us are likely to come across at least one of them in a lifetime. If you ever do, you should behave as you would if you met an enraged rhinoceros out in the bush. Climb up the nearest tree and stay there until it has gone away. This woman, in all her eccentricities and in her appearance, is almost impossible to describe, but I shall make some attempt to do so a bit later on. Let us leave her for the moment and go back to Matilda and her first day in Miss Honey's class. After the usual business of going through all the names of the children, Miss Honey handed out a brand new exercise book to each pupil. "You have all brought your own pencils, I hope," she said. "Yes, Miss Honey," they chanted. "Good. Now this is the very first day of school for each one of you. It is the beginning of at least 11 long years of schooling that all of you are going to have to go through. And 6 of those years will be spent right here at Trunchbull, where, as you know, your headmistress is Miss Trunchbull. Let me, for your own good, tell you something about Miss Trunchbull. She insists upon strict discipline throughout the school, and if you take my advice, you will do your very best to behave yourselves in her presence. Never argue with her. Never answer her back. Always do as she says. If you get on the wrong side of Miss Trunchbull, she can liquidize you like a carrot in a kitchen blender. It's nothing to laugh about, Lavender. Take that grin off your face. All of you will be wise to remember that Miss Trunchbull deals very, very severely with anyone who gets out of line in this school. Have you got the message?" "Yes, Miss Honey," chirruped 18 eager little voices. "I myself," Miss Honey went on, "want to help you to learn as much as possible while you are in this class. That is because I know it will make things easier for you later on. For example, by the end of this week, I shall expect every one of you to know the 2 times tables by heart. And in a year's time, I hope you will know all the multiplication tables up to 12. It will help you enormously if you do. Now then, do any of you already happen to have learned the 2 times tables already? Matilda put up her hand. She was the only one. Miss Honey looked carefully at the tiny girl with dark hair and a round, serious face sitting in the second row. Wonderful, she said. Please stand up and recite as much of it as you can. Matilda stood up and began to say the 2 times table. When she got to twice 12 is 24, she didn't stop. She went right on with twice 13 is 26, twice 14 is 28, twice 15 is 30, twice 16 is... Stop, Miss Honey said. She had been listening slightly spellbound to the smooth recital, and now she said, How far can you go? How far, Matilda said. Well, I don't really know, Miss Honey. For quite a long way, I think. Miss Honey took a few moments to let this curious statement sink in. You mean, she said, that you could tell me what 2 times 28 is? Yes, Miss Honey. What is it? 56, Miss Honey. What about something much harder, like 2 times 487? Could you tell me that? I think so, yes, Matilda said. Are you sure? Why, yes, Miss Honey, I'm fairly sure. What is it, then? 2 times 487. 974, Matilda said immediately. She spoke quietly and politely and without any sign of showing off. Miss Honey gazed at Matilda with absolute amazement. But when next she spoke, she kept her voice level. That is really splendid, she said. But of course, multiplying by 2 is a lot easier than some of the bigger numbers. What about the other multiplication tables? Do you know any of those? I think so, Miss Honey. I think I do. Which ones, Matilda? How far have you got? I don't quite know, Matilda said. I don't know what you mean. What I mean is, do you, for instance, know the 3 times table? Yes, Miss Honey. And the 4 times? Yes, Miss Honey. Well, how many do you know, Matilda? Do you know all the way up to the 12 times table? Yes, Miss Honey. What are 12 sevens? 84, Matilda said. Miss Honey paused and leaned back in her chair behind the plain table that stood in the middle of the floor in front of the class. She was considerably shaken by this exchange, but took care not to show it. She had never come across a 5-year-old before, or indeed a 10-year-old, who could multiply with such facility. I hope the rest of you are listening to this, she said to the class. Matilda is a very lucky girl. She has wonderful parents who have already taught her to multiply lots of numbers. Was it your mother, Matilda, who taught you? No, Miss Honey, it wasn't. You must have a great father, then. He must be a brilliant teacher. No, Miss Honey, Matilda said quietly. My father did not teach me. You mean you taught yourself? I don't quite know, Matilda said truthfully. It's just that I don't find it very difficult to multiply one number by another. Miss Honey took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She looked again at the small girl with bright eyes standing beside her desk, so sensible and solemn. You say you don't find it difficult to multiply one number by another, Miss Honey said. Could you try to explain that a little bit? Oh dear, Matilda said. I'm not really sure. Miss Honey waited. The class was silent, all listening. For instance, Miss Honey said, if I asked you to multiply 14 by 19, no, that's too difficult. It's 266, Matilda said softly. Miss Honey stared at her. Then she picked up a pencil and quickly worked out the sum on a piece of paper. What did you say it was? She said, looking up. 266, Matilda said. Miss Honey put down her pencil and removed her spectacles and began to polish the lenses with a piece of tissue. The class remained silent, watching her and waiting for what was coming next. Matilda was still standing up beside her desk. Now tell me, Matilda, Miss Honey said, still polishing. Try to tell me exactly what goes on inside your head when you get a multiplication like that to do. You obviously have to work it out in some way, but you seem to arrive at the answer almost instantly. Take the one you've just done, 14 multiplied by 19. I simply put the 14 down in my head and multiply it by 19, Matilda said. I'm afraid I don't know how else to explain it. I've always said to myself that if a little pocket calculator can do it, why shouldn't I? Why not indeed, Miss Honey said. The human brain is an amazing thing. I think it is a lot better than a lump of metal, Matilda said. That's all a calculator is. How right you are, Miss Honey said. Pocket calculators are not allowed in this school anyway. Miss Honey was feeling quite quivery. There was no doubt in her mind that she had met a truly extraordinary mathematical brain, and words like child genius and prodigy went flitting through her head. She knew that these sorts of wonders do pop up in the world from time to time, but only once or twice in 100 years. After all, Mozart was only 5 when he started composing for the piano, and look what happened to him." "It's not fair," Lavender said. "How can she do it and we can't?" "Don't worry, Lavender. Soon you'll catch up," Miss Honey said, lying through her teeth. At this point, Miss Honey could not resist the temptation of exploring still further the mind of this astonishing child. She knew that she ought to be paying some attention to the rest of the class, but she was altogether too excited to let the matter rest. "Well," she said, pretending to address the whole class, "let us leave sums for the moment and see if any of you have begun to learn to spell. Hands up, anyone who can spell cat." 3 hands went up. They belonged to Lavender, a small boy called Nigel, and Matilda. "Spell cat, Nigel." Nigel spelled it. Miss Honey now decided to ask a question that normally she would not have dreamed of asking the class on its first day. "I wonder," she said, "whether any of you 3 who know how to spell cat have learned how to read a whole group of words when they are strung together in a sentence." "I have," Nigel said. "So have I," Lavender said. Miss Honey went to the blackboard and wrote with her white chalk the sentence, "I have already begun to learn how to read long sentences." She had purposely made it difficult, and she knew that there were precious few 5-year-olds around who could be able to manage it. "Can you tell me what it says, Nigel?" she asked. "That's too hard," Nigel said. "Lavender?" "The first word is I," Lavender said. "Can any of you read the whole sentence?" Miss Honey asked, waiting for the yes that she felt certain was going to come from Matilda. "Yes," Matilda said. "Go ahead," Miss Honey said. Matilda read the sentence without any hesitation at all. "That really is very good indeed," Miss Honey said, making the understatement of her life. "How much can you read, Matilda?" "I think I can read most things, Miss Honey," Matilda said, "although I'm afraid I can't always understand the meanings." Miss Honey got to her feet and walked smartly out of the room, but was back in 30 seconds carrying a thick book. She opened it at random and placed it on Matilda's desk. "This is a book of humorous poetry," she said. "See if you can read that one aloud." Smoothly, without a pause and at a nice speed, Matilda began to read. "An epicure dining at Crewe found a rather large mouse in his stew. Cried the waiter, 'Don't shout, and wave it about, or the rest will be wanting one too.'" Several children saw the funny side of the rhyme and laughed. Miss Honey said, "Do you know what an epicure is, Matilda?" "It is someone who is dainty with his eating," Matilda said. "That is correct," Miss Honey said. "And do you happen to know what that particular type of poetry is called?" "It's called a limerick," Matilda said. "That's a lovely one. It's so funny." "It's a famous one," Miss Honey said, picking up the book and returning to her table in front of the class. "A witty limerick is very hard to write," she added. "They look easy, but they most certainly are not." "I know," Matilda said. "I've tried quite a few times, but mine are never any good." "You have you?" Miss Honey said, much more startled than ever. "Well, Matilda, I would very much like to hear one of these limericks you say you have written. Could you remember one for us?" "Well," Matilda said, hesitating, "I've actually been trying to make one up about you, Miss Honey, while we've been sitting here." "About me?" Miss Honey cried. "Well, we've certainly got to hear this one, haven't we?" "I don't think I want to say it, Miss Honey." "Please tell it," Miss Honey said. "I promise I won't mind." "I think you will, Miss Honey, because I have to use your first name to make things rhyme, and that's why I don't want to say it." "How do you know my first name?" Miss Honey asked. "I heard another teacher calling you by it just before we came in," Matilda said. "She called you Jenny." "I insist upon hearing this limerick," Miss Honey said, smiling one of her rare smiles. "Stand up and recite it." Reluctantly, Matilda stood up and very slowly, very nervously, she recited her limerick. "The thing we all ask about Jenny is surely there cannot be many young girls in the place with so lovely a face. The answer to that is not any." The whole of Miss Honey's pale and pleasant face blushed a brilliant scarlet. Then once again she smiled. It was much broader one this time, a smile of pure pleasure. "Why, thank you, Matilda," she said, still smiling. "Although it is not true, it is really a very good limerick. Oh dear, I must try to remember that one." From the third row of desks, Lavender said, "It's good, I like it." "It's true as well," a small boy called Rupert said. "Of course it's true," Nigel said. Already the whole class had begun to warm towards Miss Honey, although as yet she had hardly taken any notice of them except Matilda. "Who taught you to read, Matilda?" Miss Honey asked. "I just sort of taught myself, Miss Honey." And have you read any books all by yourself? Any children's books, I mean?" "I've read all the ones that are in the public library in the High Street, Miss Honey. And did you like them?" I like some of them very much indeed, Matilda said, but I thought others were fairly dull. Tell me the one you liked. I liked The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Matilda said. I think Mr. C.S. Lewis is a very good writer, but he has one failing. There are no funny bits in his books. You are right there, Miss Honey said. There aren't very many funny bits in Mr. Tolkien either, Matilda said. Do you think that all children's books ought to have funny bits in them, Miss Honey asked. I do, Matilda said. Children are not so serious as grown-ups, and they love to laugh. Miss Honey was astounded by the wisdom of this tiny girl. She said, And what are you going to do now that you've read all the children's books? I'm reading other books, Matilda said. I borrow them from the library. Mrs. Phelps is very kind to me. She helps me to choose them. Miss Honey was leaning far forward over her work table and gazing in wonder at the child. She had completely forgotten now about the rest of the class. What other books? She murmured. I'm very fond of Charles Dickens, Matilda said. He makes me laugh a lot, especially Mr. Pickwick. At that moment, the bell in the corridor sounded for the end of recess. Chapter 8. The Trunchbull. In the interval, Miss Honey left the classroom and headed straight for the headmistress's study. She felt wildly excited. She had just met a small girl who possessed, or so it seemed to her, quite extraordinary qualities of brilliance. There had not been time yet to find out exactly how brilliant the child was, but Miss Honey had learned enough to realize that something had to be done about it as soon as possible. It would be ridiculous to leave a child like that stuck in the bottom form. Normally, Miss Honey was terrified of the headmistress and kept well away from her, but at this moment she felt ready to take on anybody. She knocked on the door of the dreaded private study. Enter, boomed the deep and dangerous voice of Miss Trunchbull. Miss Honey went in. Now, most head teachers are chosen because they possess a number of fine qualities. They understand children, and they have the children's best interests at heart. They are sympathetic, they are fair, and they are deeply interested in education. Miss Trunchbull possessed none of these qualities, and how she had ever got her present job was a mystery. She was above all a most formidable female. She had once been a famous athlete, and even now the muscles were still clearly in evidence. You could see them in the bull neck, in the big shoulders, in the thick arms, in the sinewy wrists, and in the powerful legs. Looking at her, you got the feeling that this was someone who could bend iron bars and tear telephone directories in half. Her face, I'm afraid, was neither a thing of beauty nor a joy forever. She had an obstinate chin, a cruel mouth, and small, arrogant eyes. And as for her clothes, they were, to say the least, extremely odd. She always had on a brown cotton smock, which was pinched in around the waist with a wide leather belt. The belt was fastened in front with an enormous silver buckle. The massive thighs, which emerged from out of the smock, were encased in a pair of extraordinary breeches, bottle green in color and made of coarse twill. These breeches reached to just below the knees, and from there on down she sported green stockings with turn-up tops, which displayed her calf muscles to perfection. On her feet she wore flat-heeled brown brogues with leather flaps. She looked, in short, more like a rather eccentric and bloodthirsty follower of the staghounds than the headmistress of a nice school for children. When Miss Honey entered the study, Miss Trunchbull was standing beside her huge desk with a look of scowling impatience on her face. Yes, Miss Honey, she said. What is it you want? You're looking very flushed and flustered this morning. What's the matter with you? Have those little stinkers been flicking spitballs at you? No, headmistress, nothing like that. Well, what is it then? Get on with it. I'm a busy woman. As she spoke, she reached out and poured herself a glass of water from a jug that was always on her desk. There is a little girl in my class called Matilda Wormwood, Miss Honey began. That's the daughter of the man who owns Wormwood Motors in the village, Miss Trunchbull barked. She hardly ever spoke in a normal voice. She either barked or shouted. An excellent person, Wormwood, she went on. I was in there only yesterday. He sold me a car, almost new, only done 10,000 miles. Previous owner was an old lady who took it once a year at the most. A terrific bargain. Yes, I liked Wormwood, a real pillar of our society. He told me the daughter was a bad lot, though. He said to watch her. He said if anything bad ever happened in the school, it was certain to be his daughter who did it. I haven't met the little brat yet, but she'll know about it when I do. Her father said she's a real wart. Oh, no, headmistress, that can't be right, Miss Honey cried. Oh, yes, Miss Honey, It is darn well right. In fact, now I come to think of it, I'll bet it was she who put that stink bomb under my desk here first thing this morning. The place stank like a sewer. Of course it was her. I shall have her for that. You see if I don't. What she look like, nasty little worm, I'll be bound. I have discovered, Miss Honey, during my long career as a teacher, that a bad girl is far more dangerous a creature than a bad boy. What's more, they're much harder to squash. Squashing a bad girl is like trying to squash a blue bottle. You bang down on it and the darn thing isn't there. Nasty, dirty little things little girls are. Glad I never was one. Oh, but you must have been a little girl once, headmistress. Surely you were. Not for long anyway, Miss Trunchbull barked, grinning. I became a woman very quickly. She's completely off her rocker, Miss Honey told herself. She's barmy as a bedbug. Miss Honey stood resolutely before the headmistress. For once she was not going to be browbeaten. I must tell you, headmistress, she said, that you are completely mistaken about Matilda putting a stink bomb under your desk. I am never mistaken, Miss Honey. But, headmistress, the child only arrived in school this morning and came straight to the classroom. Don't argue with me, for heaven's sake, woman. This little brute Matilda, or whatever her name is, has stink-bombed my study. There's no doubt about it. Thank you for suggesting it. But I didn't suggest it, headmistress. Of course you did. Now what is it you want, Miss Honey? Why are you wasting my time? I came to talk to you about Matilda, headmistress. I have extraordinary things to report about the child. May I please tell you what happened in class just now? I suppose she set fire to your skirt and scorched your knickers, Miss Trunchbull snorted. No, Miss Honey cried out. Matilda is a genius. At the mention of this word, Miss Trunchbull's face turned purple, and her whole body seemed to swell up like a bullfrog's. A genius, she shouted. What piffle is this you are talking, madam? You must be out of your mind. I have her father's word for it that the child is a gangster. Her father is wrong, headmistress. Don't be a twerp, Miss Honey. You have met the little beast for only half an hour, and her father has known her all her life. But Miss Honey was determined to have her say, and she now began to describe some of the amazing things Matilda had done with arithmetic. So she's learnt a few tables by heart, has she? Miss Trunchbull barked. My dear woman, that doesn't make her a genius. It makes her a parrot. But, headmistress, she can read. So can I, Miss Trunchbull snapped. It is my opinion, Miss Honey said, that Matilda should be taken out of my form and placed immediately in the top form with the 11-year-olds. Ha! Snorted Miss Trunchbull. So you want to get rid of her, do you? So you can't handle her. So now you want to unload her on the wretched Miss Plimsoll in the top form where she will cause even more chaos. No, cried Miss Honey, that is not my reason at all. Oh, yes it is, shouted Miss Trunchbull. I can see right through your little plot, madam. And my answer is no. Matilda stays where she is, and it is up to you to see that she behaves herself. But, headmistress, please. Not another word, shouted Miss Trunchbull. And in any case, I have a rule in this school that all children remain in their own age groups, regardless of ability. Great Scott! I'm not having a little 5-year-old brigand sitting with the senior girls and boys in the top form. Who ever heard of such a thing? Miss Honey stood there helpless before this great red-necked giant. There was a lot more she would like to have said, but she knew it was useless. She said softly, Very well, then. It's up to you, headmistress. You're darn right it's up to me, Miss Trunchbull bellowed. And don't forget, madam, that we are dealing with a little viper who put a stink bomb under my desk. She did not do that, headmistress. Of course she did, Miss Trunchbull boomed. And I'll tell you what, I wish to heavens I was still allowed to use the birchen belt as I did in the good old days. I'd have roasted Matilda's bottom for her so she couldn't sit down for a month. Miss Honey turned and walked out of the study, feeling depressed, but by no means defeated. I am going to do something about this child, she told herself. I don't know what it will be, but I'll find a way to help her in the end. Chapter 9. The Parents. When Miss Honey emerged from the headmistress's study, most of the children were outside in the playground. Her first move was to go round to the various teachers who taught the senior class and borrow from them a number of textbooks, books on algebra, geometry, French, English literature, and the like. Then she sought out Matilda and called her into the classroom. There's no point, she said, in you sitting here in the class doing nothing while I am teaching the rest of the form the 2 times table and how to spell cat and rat and mouse. So during each lesson, I shall give you one of these textbooks to study. At the end of the lesson, you can come up to me with your questions if you have any, and I shall try to help you. How does that sound? Thank you, Miss Honey, Matilda said. That sounds fine. I am sure, Miss Honey said, that we'll be able to get you moved into a much higher form later on, but for the moment the headmistress wishes you to stay where you are. Very well, Miss Honey, Matilda said. Thank you so much for getting these books for me. What a nice child she is, Miss Honey thought. I don't care what her father said about her. She seems very quiet and gentle to me, and not a bit stuck up in spite of her brilliance. In fact, she hardly seems aware of it. So when the class reassembled, Matilda went to her desk and began to study a textbook on geometry, which Miss Honey had given her. The teacher kept half an eye on her all the time and noticed that the child very soon became deeply absorbed in the book. She never glanced up once during the entire lesson. Miss Honey, meanwhile, was making another decision. She was deciding that she would go herself and have a secret talk with Matilda's mother and father as soon as possible. She simply refused to let the matter rest where it was. The whole thing was ridiculous. She couldn't believe that the parents were totally unaware of their daughter's remarkable talents. After all, Mr. Wormwood, a successful motor car dealer, so she presumed that he was a fairly intelligent man himself. In any event, parents never underestimated the abilities of their own children. Quite the reverse. Sometimes it was well nigh impossible for a teacher to convince the proud father or mother that their beloved offspring was a complete nitwit. Miss Honey felt confident that she would have no difficulty in convincing Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that Matilda was something very special indeed. The trouble was going to be to stop them from getting over-enthusiastic. And now Miss Honey's hopes began to expand even farther. She started wondering whether permission might not be sought from the parents for her to give private tuition to Matilda after school. The prospect of coaching a child as bright as this appealed enormously to her professional instinct as a teacher. And suddenly she decided that she would go and call on Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that very evening. She would go fairly late, between 9 and 10 o'clock, when Matilda was sure to be in bed. And that is precisely what she did. Having got the address from the school records, Miss Honey set out to walk from her own home to the Wormwoods' house shortly after 9. She found the house in a pleasant street where each smallish building was separated from its neighbors by a bit of garden. It was a modern brick house that could not have been cheap to buy, and the name on the gate said Cozy Nook. Nosy Cook might have been better, Miss Honey thought. She was given to playing with words in that way. She walked up the path and rang the bell, and while she stood waiting, she could hear the television blaring inside. The door was opened by a small, ratty-looking man with a thin, ratty mustache who was wearing a sports coat that had orange and red stripe in the material. Yes, he said, peering out at Miss Honey. If you're selling raffle tickets, we don't want any. I'm not, Miss Honey said, and please forgive me for butting in on you like this. I am Matilda's teacher at school, and it is important I have a word with you and your wife. Got into trouble already, has she? Mr. Wormwood said, blocking the doorway. Well, she's your responsibility from now on. You'll have to deal with her. She's no trouble at all, Miss Honey said. I have come with good news about her. Quite startling news, Mr. Wormwood. Do you think I might come in for a few minutes and talk to you about Matilda? We are right in the middle of watching one of our favorite programs, Mr. Wormwood said. This is most inconvenient. Why don't you come back another time? Miss Honey began to lose patience. Mr. Wormwood, she said, if you think some rotten TV program is more important than your daughter's future, then you ought not to be a parent. Why don't you switch the darn thing off and listen to me? That shook Mr. Wormwood. He was not used to being spoken to in this way. He peered carefully at the slim, frail woman who stood so resolutely out on the porch. Oh, very well then, he snapped. Come on in and let's get this over with. Miss Honey stepped briskly inside. Mrs. Wormwood isn't going to thank you for this, the man said as he led her into the sitting room, where a large, platinum-blonde woman was gazing rapturously at the TV screen. Who is it? The woman said, not looking around. Some school teacher, Mr. Wormwood said. She says she's got to talk to us about Matilda. He crossed to the TV set and turned down the sound, but left the picture on the screen. Don't do that, Harry, Miss Wormwood cried out. Willard is just about to propose to Angelica. You can still watch it while we're talking, Mr. Wormwood said. This is Matilda's teacher. She says she's got some sort of news to give us. My name is Jennifer Honey, Miss Honey said. How do you do, Mrs. Wormwood? Mrs. Wormwood glared at her and said, What's the trouble, then? Nobody invited Miss Honey to sit down, so she chose a chair and sat down anyway. This, she said, was your daughter's first day at school. We know that, Mrs. Wormwood said, ratty about missing her program. Is that all you came to tell us? Miss Honey stared hard into the other woman's wet gray eyes, and she allowed the silence to hang in the air until Mrs. Wormwood became uncomfortable. Do you wish me to explain why I came, she said. Get on with it, then, Mrs. Wormwood said. I'm sure you know, Miss Honey said, that children in the bottom class at school are not expected to be able to read or spell or juggle with numbers when they first arrive. 5-year-olds cannot do that, but Matilda can do it all, and if I am to believe her, I wouldn't, Mrs. Wormwood said. She was still ratty at losing the sound on the TV. Was she lying then, Miss Honey said, when she told me that nobody taught her to multiply or to read? Did either of you teach her? Teach her what? Mr. Wormwood said. To read books, Miss Honey said. Perhaps you did teach her. Perhaps she was lying. Perhaps you have shelves full of books all over the house. I wouldn't know. Perhaps you are both great readers. Of course we read, Mr. Wormwood said. Don't be so daft. I read the autocar and the motor from the cover to cover every week. This child has already read an astonishing number of books, Miss Honey said. I was simply trying to find out if she came from a family that loved good literature. We don't hold with book reading, Mr. Wormwood said. You can't make a living from sitting on your fanny and reading storybooks. We don't keep them in the house. I see, Miss Honey said. Well, all I came to tell you was that Matilda has a brilliant mind, but I expect you know that already. Of course I knew she could read, the mother said. She spends her life up in her room buried in some silly book. But does it not intrigue you, Miss Honey said, that a little 5-year-old child is reading long adult novels by Dickens and Hemingway? Doesn't that make you jump up and down with excitement? Not particularly, the mother said. I'm not in the favor of blue stocking girls. A girl should think about making herself look attractive so she can get a good husband later on. Looks is more important than books, Miss Hunky. The name is Honey, Miss Honey said. Now look at me, Mrs. Wormwood said. Then look at you. You chose books, I chose looks. Miss Honey looked at the plain, plump person with the smug, suet-pudding face who was sitting across the room. What did you say? She asked. I said you chose books and I chose looks, Mrs. Wormwood said. And who's finished up the better off? Me, of course. I'm sitting pretty in a nice house with a successful businessman, and you're left slaving away, teaching a lot of nasty children the ABC. Quite right, Mr. Wormwood said, casting a look of such simpering sloppiness at his wife that it could have made a cat sick. Miss Honey decided that if she was going to get anywhere with these people, she must not lose her temper. I haven't told you all of it yet, she said. Matilda, so far as I can gather at this early stage, is also a kind of mathematical genius. She can multiply complicated figures in her head like lightning. What's the point of that when you can buy a calculator, Mr. Wormwood said. A girl doesn't get a man by being brainy, Mrs. Wormwood added. Look at that film star, for instance, she added, pointing at the silent TV screen, where a bosomy female was being embraced by a craggy actor in the moonlight. You don't think she got him to do that by multiplying figures at him, do you? Not likely. And now he's going to marry her? You see if he doesn't, and if she's going to live in a mansion with a butler and lots of maids. Miss Honey could hardly believe that what she was hearing. She had heard that parents like this existed all over the place and that their children turned out to be delinquents and dropouts, but it was still a shock to meet a pair of them in the flesh. Matilda's trouble, she said, trying once again, is that she is so far ahead of everyone else around her that it might be worth thinking about some extra kind of private tuition. I seriously believe she could be brought up to university standard in 2 or 3 years with proper coaching. University! Mr. Wormwood shouted, bouncing up in his chair. Who wants to go to university, for heaven's sake? All they learn there is bad habits. That is not true, Miss Honey said. If you had a heart attack this minute and had to call a doctor, that doctor would be a university graduate. If you got sued for selling someone a rotten secondhand car, you'd have to get a lawyer, and he'd be a university graduate. 2. Do not despise clever people, Mr. Wormwood, but I can see we're not going to agree. I'm sorry to burst in on you like this. Miss Honey rose from her chair and walked out of the room. Mr. Wormwood followed her to the front door and said, Good of you to come, Miss Hawks, or is it Miss Harris? It's neither, Miss Honey said, but let it go. And away she went. So that was the end of chapter 9. So we've discovered that Matilda is some kind of genius. She is extremely gifted and talented. She is unusual in ways that we might not have known before. And her lovely teacher, Miss Honey, saw it. Unfortunately, the headmistress, the principal at this school, Miss Trunchbull, doesn't seem to like children or to care. In fact, she's listening to Mr. Wormwood and thinks Matilda is a delinquent, a criminal, a naughty child. Can you imagine being as smart as Matilda and having parents like this? At least she has a teacher that believes in her. So inshallah, in a few days, we'll see what is going on next with Matilda. It's been good to catch up with you guys. I hope you enjoy. And let me know your feelings on these few chapters. I hope everybody's Ramadan is going well and you are having a good time with your family and friends. Mostly family since we're in lockdown. Anyway, assalamu alaikum. See you.